Now what I want to do is add a new class to the project, but without going through the usual Visual Studio interface. So this class will be SQL restaurant data that implements iRestaurant data. And instead of the usual interface, I'll again put my cursor on the class name, press Control period, and say that I want to move this type to its own file. So now I have a class in its own file without right-clicking on the project. So SQL restaurant data, it's going to implement iRestaurant data. Let's go ahead and use Control period again and say implement interface. And now we can work through each of the methods on iRestaurant data. So first of all, in order for SQL restaurant data to do anything meaningful, it's going to need an instance of ODFOOD DB context. And like everything in ASP.NET Core, we want to avoid constructing an ODFOOD DB context ourselves. Instead, I just want to ask for this as a constructor parameter. So I'll take a parameter named DB of type ODFOOD DB context. I'm going to use Control period to initialize a field with that DB value. And the beauty of all this is, through the magic of configure services, ASP.NET Core is going to come across some component or some Razor page that needs something that implements iRestaurant data. We're going to configure in SQL restaurant data to be injected for iRestaurant data. And ASP.NET Core is going to see, oh, the SQL restaurant data needs a DB context. Let me work with the entity framework to grab one of those and pass that into the constructor. So there's nothing else I have to do to receive a DB context. And now when someone wants to add a new restaurant, this is a very simple operation with the entity framework. I can go to my restaurants property and I can say add here. I can also actually just say add right off of the DB context, because the entity framework is going to be smart enough to say, oh, you're passing in an object of type restaurant. You must want that added to the restaurants collection, which is really the restaurants table inside of the database. So add this new restaurant that someone has passed in. And since we are forced to return a restaurant, let's just also return that new restaurant. The commit operation with the entity framework, also very simple. With the entity framework on the DB context, there's a method save changes. All I need to do is invoke this method. This method does return an integer, which represents the number of rows affected in the database. So I'm just going to go ahead and return the value returned by save changes. Now there's the delete operation. What I'm going to do is first go out and find the restaurant to delete. This is very similar to our implementation in the in-memory restaurant data. Well, let me do that just by going to the getById method that we already have available. So find me a restaurant, and then if that restaurant is not equal to null, I know this restaurant exists in the database, then I want to go up to the restaurant's dbset property on my DB context and tell it to remove this restaurant that I just queried for. And at that point, we can return the restaurant. And I do want to point out operations like db.restaurants.remove and up here under add, the db.add new restaurant, nothing will change in the database until someone calls commit. That's when the entity framework tries to reconcile all the changes that I've asked for with the database. So it says, oh, you've added 2 restaurants and removed 1. Let me issue 2 insert statements and a delete statement. That's what happens during save changes. And all those changes happen atomically. Now let's implement getById. This is also a very simple operation with the entity framework. On the restaurants DB set, or on every DB set really, there is a find method where I can just pass in the primary key or the key values for a particular entity, and the entity framework will figure out how to track down that entity inside of the database. So for restaurants, there's a single key. It's the ID property. I just pass that into find. If the entity framework can find that restaurant, it will return the restaurant. If it cannot find the restaurant, it will return null. And that's perfect behavior for what we need. Let's also look at get restaurants by name. So now we can write more of a link query. So I could say from R, which is a restaurant, in db.restaurants, where r.name starts with this incoming name, or the name is empty. So these expressions are actually C# code that the entity framework can translate into a SQL query against the database. So all of the heavy work occurs inside of the database, including the order by. So I can say, let's order by the name of the restaurant, and then select that restaurant, and then return this query. Now you might have noticed the little red squiggly here. We were not getting much help through IntelliSense. All of that was because I did not have system.link included. that namespace. That brings in all the extension methods that are the magic behind this particular query operation. And now you'll notice that the query looks fine, there's no red squigglies, and I should also have IntelliSense help inside of here, so when I say r.something, I know I'm looking at a restaurant, which is good. Now for update. An update operation with the entity framework can look different depending on what you want to achieve, but here's the approach I'm going to use. First of all, I'm going to use a method on my restaurants DB set, which is the attach method. And what I want to attach is this updated restaurant. So attach is a way of telling the entity framework, I'm about to give you an object that represents information that is already in the database. But I want to give you this object because I want you to start tracking changes about this object. So I'm not adding a new restaurant. I'm not trying to retrieve this restaurant from the database. I already have all the restaurant data here inside of an entity object, and I'm just going to attach it to the DB context so that the DB context can manage that particular restaurant, that entity. And then I'm going to tell the entity framework that the state of this particular entity, this restaurant, is modified. So I can say entity state.modified. And to make this code look a little bit better, I can get rid of the namespace portion and then use control period to bring in the namespace, which is Microsoft.entityFramework.core. So essentially what we have done, which is I now have to return the updated restaurant to return a restaurant. But what we've done is we've attached this entity to the entity framework. We've told the entity framework that it is modified. So the entity framework has to assume that everything about this restaurant has changed, except for the ID. But the name might be different and the cuisine might be different. And so now when someone calls save changes and the entity framework is reconciling all the changes I've made, it's going to come to this particular restaurant and say, I need to issue an update statement. I need to make sure all those attributes in the database for this particular entity match the values that are in the properties right now. And that's what will happen when someone calls save changes. And with that, we now have a complete implementation of SQL Restaurant data. We should now try it out in the application.